Hello and welcome to the next episode of a webinar series hosted by Vic No-Till, focusing on relevant issues around soil carbon through a closer look at strategies to increase soil organic matter. This project is funded by Wimmera CMA through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. We would very much like to thank them for their support. For those that missed last week's webinar with Graeme, we have it recorded and it's available on our YouTube channel. We're fortunate enough to be joined again by Graeme today. Graeme is one of Australia's leading holistic land management and training consultants who has over 25 years of planned grazing experience and holistic management training. This webinar is the third of a series of 6 with Graeme, looking at rotational grazing. There was some really good Q&A that came in last week throughout the webinar, and I encourage that again. So if you have any questions, just fire them away down in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and Graeme will address them as he goes. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome back Graeme to the webinar. So welcome, Graeme.
Thanks, Dan. I'll just share my screen, get rid of that. Yeah, I'd also like to thank the Wimmera CMA and the National Landcare program and Vic No-Till for getting these together. Any questions you've got would be fantastic. Really makes it live and live for me. I was just going to do a quick recap and then sort of some of the ways and tests and things that we've done, and also just some of the financial design stuff for low cost, low risk. So I tend to be in that sort of section of the market. So really in that low cost, low risk. When I was starting sort of doing training and consulting and advising and stuff, I was down in Hamilton and we had a meeting with all the other consultants down there, and I just said, oh, well, I looked at the market that was down around Hamilton and everyone was in high input, high cost sort of advising. So I went diagonally opposite and went to low cost, low risk. And one of them said, oh, you thought about it. And it was then when we were talking about that I realized that they thought I'd gone for low cost, low risk because I wasn't smart enough to do the high cost, high risk, which I thought was an interesting assumption. So yeah, I'm really waiting for the next lot of ABARES figures to drop, so that we can see what's happening, because these are still estimates and forecasts, and just see what's happening here and if we're going to head towards that 81 billion, or has that gap been narrowed by increased input costs. So I think agribusiness is looking at the same graph. So and if we have any failures, we increase debt, which isn't good. So it's about minimising losses and rather than maximising production, and most businesses are over-intensified for optimising profits. So I always say be very, very afraid if your advisor, all they talk about is maximising production, because production's important, but it's about minimising the losses. So how can you find that sweet spot that you don't have any losses? So just that risks in agriculture. So debt season and market price, or rainfall, debt, rainfall and market price. Sort of trying to work on continually decreasing debt rather than continually allowing debt to expand, and making sure that everyone can meet their repayments, and sort of how do you redesign out of that. Seasonal risk is a bit harder to do, but I think that that drought resilience, and I've been working with the drought hubs around the East Coast and down in Tasmania on just how do we lower or increase that resilience to drought. So I'm saying, you've got to have increasing landscape function. And I would say that that's sort of my focus. Someone asked me the other day what I meant by the different advisors and their different focus. And I was saying, well, if you stopped me in the street, what would I say? I would talk about landscape function as being the most important thing to do with grazing. So grazing's about, and cropping, I believe, is about increasing landscape function. And I've got some ground cover satellite data for Stephen Hobbs' property as well. We need long recoveries of pastures to link up growing seasons. So, we're talking about leaf emergence rate. So, and that's driven by moisture and temperature. So you need long recoveries so that you link enough of those moisture and temperature events to make sure that you don't run out of feed. Grazing fails when you run out of feed. So how do you make it drought proof? By having those minimum and maximum recoveries so that you know that you've sort of got it under control, that you're not going to run out of grass. And I think that we probably need some other enterprises not linked to rainfall, not putting, I see all the eggs in one basket differently than a lot of other people. They think if they have grazing and cropping, whereas to me, they're all in the one basket of rainfall or seasonal risk. So you've got to have something that's outside that, I believe. I don't know what it is. And then market price. If you're just a commodity in the commodity arena, then you need to be a low-cost producer. So the three arenas are sort of commodity, contract, and branded market. So that's that sort of three arenas. And the key to being successful in the commodity is to be a low-cost producer. I'll come back to this a bit later, but I think we design barriers to profit into the business, and I think we really need to do that. I get great success by setting people up to do a monthly monitoring and corrective action meeting. So on a monthly basis, not on a quarterly, it's too late. You've already lost too much time. On a monthly basis, you're comparing actual to plan and then taking corrective action. And I'll come back and explain how we do that. But that seems to be once that step's implemented, then the rest flows. So I've been thinking about it as reverse learning rather than sort of learning all the steps on how to do that. Just get any budget, even if it's last year's budget, and then monitor it against the actuals and take corrective action and see how it goes. Because it's not taking that corrective action on a monthly basis that stops people ending up with a profit at the end of the year. Most businesses underestimate the impact of debt, rainfall, and market price risk. We tend to be very optimistic. I'm the same as everyone else, so saw no problem with borrowing up near 100% to buy a property, and then sort of it all starts to stop raining, and prices go against you, etc. The other barrier is that if you're going to be doing grazing, you've got to have that convenient infrastructure. It really stops people from focusing on just making money out of the animals. So how do you get that convenient infrastructure, convenient yards, convenient laneways? All those things have got to be right. Animal phenotypes, we're going to be heading towards those more robust sort of animals. Designing the enterprise properly so that it is low cost, low risk. Make sure that you're designing it so that it's based on your data and it actually is profitable most years. The confusion between agronomy and business. So when I do that thing about which crops do you plant or what grazing do you do that actually makes money most years, so 9 out of 10 years, people say, oh, well, that one, that crop doesn't make money, but I need it sort of for a disease break or a weed break or something. And I think that's confusing agronomy and business. If the crop doesn't make money on a consistent basis, you need to design the business differently. And typically, I would argue that you should go back to some sort of grazing on those paddocks. and then make sure that it's low cost, low risk grazing that increases landscape function because it'll regenerate that soil. And just that seventh point, the gross margins are, they're just unsuitable for designing a profit. You've got to use your figures, your risks, your outcomes, not someone else's safe to fail trials. And sort of trying to say, oh, this is what the gross margin is for that. Is that what you're achieving on your place is more important than reading any of those figures. So, yeah. Having worked at the DPI down at Hamilton, I actually sort of found that some of the advice I was supposed to be going out and extending to people, and the one that sticks in my mind a lot is sort of planting tall wheatgrass onto salt discharge areas. And when you went back and looked at the research, the natural regeneration was equally as profitable as the planting the tall wheatgrass, but it had lower production. So we were told that we had to go out and sort of extend that whole idea of planting tall wheatgrass on salt skulls. When you looked at them, when they did the research to do that work, they had a couple of establishment failures, which isn't surprising. You're trying to put a perennial grass into a salt skull. And if you included those failures of getting it established, that idea never made money in most people's lifetime. So we've got to be really careful about advice. And I always, when I was living at Branksome, I'd always say I would never take advice from a little fella from Branksome. So you really need to be making sure that you're checking, does it work on my place? What are the numbers for my place? What can I do with my soils, with my animals, with my machinery, with my skills? That's more important than reading those other things. They'll give you a guide, but really aren't all that important. Trying to do is make sure that sort of simultaneously we're increasing landscape function, people well-being and profit. So we're trying to say, and this is what I've been trying to get across, is that money and people need to be nested or contained in this land that's constantly improving. The language I use and the research, the peer-reviewed research I use is landscape function, CSIRO peer-reviewed research. And we need to be restoring biodiversity in the soils and in the wildlife and everything else as well. So we need to be doing all of those. Low risk profit. Agriculture's a funny beast. It's not like the stock market. The stock market rewards risk generally, but agriculture's the opposite. It punishes risk. So you've got to design away from risk. How can you design things that heads you win, tails you win? And well-being is really important. Sort of, we need more people enjoying and thriving in and actively promoting agriculture. So I always, when I go to people's places, you can really pick up very quickly if they're actively promoting agriculture to their families and to others, and they're designing the business so that others can take over and stuff. So they don't have that child abuse sort of idea. So landscape function, CSIRO, old people can learn it. So Colin and I can learn it. David Tongway training us, travelled all over the world, not travelling at the moment, sort of, he's got a crook back and stuff. So I was in touch with him last week about some things. And just sort of monitoring and measuring the soil surface. So this is about how do we manage the soil surface to change the soil. So landscape function is about using those soil surface indicators to tell you how the soil's functioning as a whole. I'll just quickly do this as a group. Just wanted to make sure that these relationships are really clear. If you don't want it to erode, then it's got to be covered. If you want it to infiltrate water and cycle nutrients, Ideally, in a grazing situation, it would be perennial grass. Sort of, it's like as if perennial grass has lost its novelty. When people are talking to me about pastures now, I have to check what they actually mean by a pasture, because it's usually something else other than perennial grass. Perennial grass is incredibly important because of their fibrous roots, for their long lived time, for their ability to increase soil carbon. So shifting from annuals to perennial grass usually increases soil carbon. That's in all the research and stuff, that we increase soil carbon. For water infiltration, they provide not only that acting as a funnel, a big mature perennial grass, but they're actually slowing water as it comes down, because usually they're proud of the soil surface. Litter cover is important, and that surface roughness. The big one for nutrient cycling, the big two sort of for nutrient cycling, is that basal cover of perennial grass. How much of each hectare is covered with mature perennial grass bases that are more than 2 centimetres by 2 centimetres? You should be able to step from one grass to the other, and they should be mature perennial grasses greater than 4 square centimetres. And you need about, to really make a difference, you need close to 30% of each hectare covered with these mature perennial grass bases. Seems like that all stabilises and stops litter washing, produces enough litter to cover the intertussock space. And then you need that litter decomposing. So litter decomposing is a really important thing. This is slight decomposition down here in the bottom left. This is so it's just composting, it's breaking down, it'll be going brown, it'll be forming smaller particles. This is a fungal attack of the decomposing litter, or sort of moderate decomposition in the landscape function sort of manuals. That's what it'd be. And it's the common link between grazing, cropping, hort and forestry. So if you've got healthy bush, it will usually, if it's healthy bush, not usually, if it's healthy bush, it will have visible attack of the litter. So if you go into any of your sort of bush paddocks or regen areas, pull the litter back. So you should have 100% ground cover of a reasonably deep, about 20, 25 mils of litter, and you pull it back, it should have visible fungal attack if it's healthy bush. If it's not, then it needs to be managed differently. So, so in our environments, in our seasonally humid environments, we need to actively manage the soil surface to create this decomposing litter. So that's a real key for knowing whether it is. So any time you get to look at roadsides, in bush, wherever, you pull that litter back, dig down through it, and then find what's happening at the soil surface. Is it wicking into the soil surface like Velcro, so that it actually is intimately connected with the soil surface, and you have to grab it and tear it out of the soil to get the litter out? So all those things are what we know are required to reduce erosion, increase water infiltration, and increase nutrient cycling. And I think nutrient cycling is how we become that low-cost, low-risk producer. This is just Gabe Brown's, and he's got sort of slight decomposition. He also has areas with moderate, but that photos there is slight decomposition of the litter. You can see that brown colour, and that's what creates the healthy soils. So a lot of what he's doing is not using inputs, but the way he activates the soil and stuff is through this decomposing litter, and he also does the cover crops. So, Dwayne Beck, Dwayne, I've forgotten his name, from I think it's got a 4 in front of it. Dwayne Beck from the Dakota Lakes Research Farm. says that most of the cover crop areas that he goes to are overusing legumes, and they're too high, too low in carbon nitrogen ratio for healthy soil. So some of that stuff I can, if it's of interest, I've got links to it and stuff. This is how a grass plant grows. Ready to be grazed, no evidence of cut off tips, no chewed off tips, fresh litter. The animals push it down. The root reserves, so I'm talking about root reserve driven recovery, not leaf driven recovery. I'm saying graze it severely, as severe as you can while you're getting animal performance, which is, it takes some skill. But the crowns love being opened up and stimulated. They want to be severely grazed. The plant mobilizes its root reserves and regrows this leaf. This leaf is what really needs to be understood, and that is leaf growing from root reserves. If you graze that leaf off before the plant becomes energy positive and replaced its root reserves, you'll overgraze it, and eventually you kill out the better perennials. So it usually starts with the better perennial grasses, then goes down, and it'll go down to unpalatable ones. So it's also toxic at that stage. It'll scour the sheep. They'll have dirty tails. So a lot of the problem with worms and animal health is that we give them grass that's too young, too high in non-protein nitrogen, scours the lining off the gut, which creates the conditions for other things, the worms, etc., to establish. So you need to be giving them grass that doesn't scour them and feed that doesn't scour them. We're using protein like salt or something. If a little's good, then a lot must be better, and that's not the case. The protein in this plant at this stage is also like non-protein nitrogen. It really hasn't formed true amino acids, so it is toxic to animals. I've tried lots of ways of trying to get people to be aware of this. Like it's usually when near the end of fights and all that, live in the grass. If you're getting animal health issues, if you're getting scours in your lambs, any of those sort of things, then it's usually because of this grass. So most metabolic diseases are created by grass too young. If the grass is too old, you'll get good dung scores and really firm, hard pellets, but they won't. But their animal health will be good, but their performance won't be good. So it's a bit sort of, if it's too young, it's got excess non-protein nitrogen, so you can get some performance for a while. They usually grow really fast for a while, and then they'll slow down as the filters block up in the body. Up here, it hasn't got enough protein and energy, and it requires selecting for a different animal. But that's the end that regenerates your soil. If you got to here and graze that grass plant, you wouldn't kill it. It's replaced its root reserves enough, but you wouldn't build landscape function. You'd miss out. You'd have bare ground between the perennial grasses. And that eventually leads to losing the plants, and you get about half your nutrient cycling, and you're still getting massive erosion. So, I've never understood. So in the high rainfall zone, we talk about a good target being 70% ground cover. And so I try and be emotive and just say, so only 30% of the land's eroding. It just doesn't make sense. We need 100% of the land not eroding on your place. And then it's regrown fresh litter. It'll be in the bases of the plants. It won't have the cut-off tips. All those cut-off tips now are in the litter, and it's ready to be grazed. So I'm saying in a safe to fail trial, try and do that. It may or may not work on your land, but just give it a go and see what happens. One of the things that I've been trying to do is link how we apply animals to the land with how we change the soil surface. So as you increase recovery, you increase soil cover because you're giving something some time to grow. The basal area of the perennial grasses increase. You grow more litter, which allows it to form composting litter, and you get rougher rougher surfaces, and that's because the perennial bases of the grasses start to get up proud of the soil surface, which is a good thing because it slows down the water and any sort of movement of things so that it soaks into the ground. So recovery increases, you increase nearly all the major indicators. If you increase stock density, you increase cover because you germinate things. So you actually will germinate through that stock density. There's a threshold below which you'll tend to germinate annual type plants, forbs and annual grasses. Over a certain stock density, you actually start to germinate the perennial grasses. And it appears, and it's really hard to find any research, it appears that stock density, so herd effect would be the way Alan Savory, that you're actually sort of getting that twist or that scarifying or something, or soil to seed contact, and it'll favour the germination of the perennial grass seeds in the soil. So I say at least have one area that you don't add anything to, but you graze it with very long recoveries at high stock density to try and be over that threshold that germinates whatever perennial grass seed is in the soil. We've never found anywhere that doesn't have perennial grass seed. There is a few areas that sort of it's a bit slow and not enough. And then, but once you've got that information of what's your viable soil seed bank, you can then make a sensible decision on what are you going to do. Are you going to re-sow? And like that might be a valid thing to do. You're going to have this paddock out of crop for sort of 5 to 10 years. I'm going to re-sow and get it back and start increasing landscape function, get the nutrient cycling so that it'll behave like fresh ground when I go back into it. Stock density also makes sure that you've got that litter pushed onto, not into, onto the soil surface. So it's just pushing it onto. If you lightly disc green material into the soil, then you'll get more bacterial growth. If you push litter onto the soil surface, then you'll get more fungal content in your soil. So conventional agriculture favours and drives the soil to be too high in bacteria and too low in fungi to get that cycling. So pushing it onto the soil, not into, onto the soil surface is the way of getting that back to that composting litter. Also, sorry, I'll just go back. This degree of composting. So people may have heard of the Johnson Sioux static aerated compost, and they've done a lot of research on the diversity of life in compost. And there's a flip somewhere out between around 9 to 12 months, where again you get over a threshold that you get a massive increase in diversity of the life in the compost. And from what I'm seeing, it also applies in the grazing. So it needs to have that complexity to start improving the soil surface and cycling nutrients and doing all those other things. And then plant utilisation. As you increase plant utilisation, what I've found is it stimulates the crowns of the perennial grasses. So you actually need to clear their throats. So my definition of when a perennial grass is recovered is that it looks like an ungrazed plant, which is Alan Savory's part, and contains fresh yellow litter, which is my part. Because what happens is that you clear the throats of the grasses and refresh them, and you're doing that on an annual plus basis, and that keeps them healthy and stimulated and increasing healthy big basal areas or bases of the perennial grasses. When I've spoken to some of the First Nations guys that burn, they actually talk about sort of using a similar trigger, sort of. So when they're doing a cool burn, they're clearing the throats of the perennial grasses is the way I think about it. if a grass plant dies from not having the litter cleared out of it and chokes itself out, it'll tend to go, there's a tendency, about 70%, that you'll get woody plants coming back in. So a lot of the time that shift to woody plants is because you haven't cleared the throats or cleared the litter out from the growth points of the perennial grasses. Quite a lot of the perennial grasses will then shoot their growth point up the stem and grow from there, but that's not as healthy as when they're growing from down here at the soil surface. So if you let the plants not have their throats cleared, so several years of no grazing, no mowing or whatever, you'll have a tendency to shift to woody weeds, I call them, so woody type plants. A lot of the time when I'm driving around, I see those headlands and corners and stuff going back to trees, to woody plants of some sort. And it depends how healthy the soil is, whether it's a reasonable tree or just a woody weed. So that's a really important thing, knowing about clearing the throats of the grasses. And that plant utilization actually stimulates, I'll finish the weeds while I'm on it. So woody plants tend to be from perennial grasses choking themselves out from not having the litter cleared out from their growth points. If you overgraze and come back to grasses too quickly, to perennial grasses too quickly, so too short a recovery on your rotation, you'll tend to go to forbs and annuals. So you're coming back too short, you're weakening the roots of the perennial grasses from coming back too short a recovery, and that'll favour your flatweeds, your thistles, your forbs, your in New South Wales, your paddo, so whatever that weed is that annoys you, it's usually a lot of the time it's from the recoveries too short in those grazing areas. So there's woody from choking themselves out. So that's usually too low a stock density and too low a utilisation. And then there's the forbs, annuals, thistly, broadleafy type things, which is from recovery too short. So they're at different ends, and if that's of interest, I can do more about that and put in some photos and examples of how that happens. So so if it was whatever those plants are that sort of annoying you, and that we can usually diagnose, well, is it recovery too short, or is it stock density and plant utilization too low? And this plant utilization, it actually assists with getting that composting of the litter cover. So when you're in there, you've got these perennial grasses that are got fresh litter in them. The idea is during the growing season, you graze the green out and push the litter onto the soil surface. Sheep and horses can pick up litter better than cows do. So you've got to make sure that you're not letting them pick that up. But the overall failure that I see is poor animal performance, because people push the animals too hard. So they've gone from not having these tools of stock density and high plant utilization to having them, and most of us go too hard, too early with stock density and plant utilization, and make them eat things that don't allow them to have animal performance. So I can talk about that more next time we get together. So that's all those relationships and that. So the grazing, the way we apply the grazing changes the soil surface, which changes the landscape function. So I'm trying to get people to do more research on this so that we can actually start to sort of see, what is the best bets in this area? So whenever anyone monitors some land somewhere, I want some best bets. Is it root-driven, or is it leaf-driven recovery as they're using? What's their approximate recovery, sort of stock density, and and then sort of this root-driven and leaf-driven, and how are they trying to eat it? If they're trying to eat half, they're going for leaf. if they're trying to eat most of it, they're going for root-driven recovery. And hopefully that sort of links. I don't know whether it is. It's like looks like death by PowerPoint, I've been told, with just all the interactions. But it's really just that direction I'm trying to say is how you apply changes this, changes that. So I won't bang on. So was there any comments or questions or any thoughts on sort of this table that I presented based on sort of what I've been trying to do is sort of get people sort of, and this is stuff I've made up. So this is based on if you stopped one of these trainers or one of these people in the street, what would they talk to you about? What would they talk to you about in terms of the way they're grazing? So Gabe Brown down here, he'd talk about sort of closer to landscape function. It's his version of landscape function. So soil armor, fungal, he'd be all into that. And then from that, he'd be talking about these dollars and, profit from dollars and low risk and low cost, not having to use sort of, what does he call it? Synthetic fertilizers. So I'm not sure about the language. I would be talking about landscape function. I'd be talking about decomposing litter in the intertussock space, whether it was cropping or whatever. It would always be that 100% ground cover with decomposing litter. When I speak to most of the other holistic management trainers, I'm in that tribe, they talk to me and they have in their promotional material that you can increase your stocking rate. So, like that tends to be a real thing. And Johan Zeitsman, he talks about profit through stocking rate, being able to double. Alan Saver will talk about quadrupling your stocking rate. Jim Elizondo was trained by Johan. He's now got his own consultancy, but he still talks about doubling the stocking rate. Alan Williams, when I watch his, he works with Gabe on the Understanding Ag, he talks about stocking rate, and Joel talks about cow days. Joel Salatin will talk about cow days. So it's not a scientific survey. It's only from what I've gleaned from what they talk about and what they focus on. And when I talk to people that have been trained by the different trainers, that's the things they'll present to me and talk about. I won't do this again, just the definition of perennial grass recovery. It depends on temperature and soil moisture. Just that again, safe to fail trials. So safe to fail trials, then safe to fail strips. Do at least one paddock that you do with some strips just to check and confirm, see if it works. I've got some sheep fencing up further. I just think that's sort of, we've got to make sure that it works before we do it. I would never, and then I'd compare leaf driven and root reserve and see what happens over time. Check whether my sort of, my experience is that if you go for leaf driven recovery, over time you'll lose the better perennial grasses. So check whether that happens, but it might be 5 years out sort of thing. And then if that works for you, so these ones are checking and confirming, does it work for you, doing your own trials, trying to find things that fail so that to steer away from them, and then do that. I'll put in this, don't keep subdividing paddocks. I just don't see how it can work. What did I say to a group earlier this week was that you'll be 1,000 years old before you can subdivide enough paddocks. You've got to break out of that. Stop trying to think of subdividing. Start to think, how can I do this with strips? And then getting the right animal phenotypes that thrive under this management. I still can't find anything. This seems to be the main barriers to success. Knowing what works with your management, your animals. I get from the people want me to design something that they want to do rather than what works. And sort of, I must be getting too old, but I can't do that anymore. I just say, this is what works. You work out how to do it. And so get a bit schoolmaster with them. So, but and then just using those safe to fail trials as navigation aids. Just an updated photo of what's happening in the safe to fail trial down at Conniver at Stephen Hobbs. This looks pretty good, this outside where he that's had sort of recovery as well here. There is some perennials coming back up in there, so it'll be that perennial density. Yeah, thanks, Liz. I've really, so Liz is asking about the virtual fencing, or making a comment, sorry, about the virtual fencing. I just think it's a problem that in Victoria, as far as I know, so this mightn't be the latest, we're not allowed to use the shock on those collars for animal welfare reasons. So you can only use the buzzer, and I can't see how that can work. I haven't seen it successfully work. I think it would get like a 20% improvement in the landscape function because it's very hard to get them tight enough. But I think it could work. And I'm waiting for it. I've got it on my list of things to keep looking back at and keep an eye on, because I think it could be the thing that we need as a bit of a breakthrough. So, but that's as far as I know, that you're not allowed to use the shocks on the collars. There's a guy that is in one of my mentoring groups, Ray Lord, that's done a fair bit of work. And what he found was that if he did things like, this was with cattle, and in Queensland, that if he did things like gave them a visual barrier, so that they got used to walking up. So he put flags, so surveyor type flags, in a line where the fence was, so that they'd learn that was sort of a cue. So he trained them. And I think from the way he talks, I haven't seen it, but it feels like you could actually make that work, that if you train them not to run through. I'm not sure that's what everyone thinks. I'm sure about the shock thing, that it's like saying you can't have an electric fence because they might go up and shock themselves. The animals learn pretty quick not to go up and shock themselves. They don't keep going back and repeatedly shocking themselves. So I'll be making sure, like if we do get it, we're going to need to be able to do that. But I'll just finish that on that. What Ray's been doing is he gives them a sort of some visual cues so that they learn. He makes sure that they're fully fed till they're trained. And then he said that, they then start to move and understand what their boundaries are, and they're checking. So they're checking to make sure that they're not going to go outside the boundaries. So they listen, and everyone will turn as soon as they hear the buzzers. So this is the soil surface. This is the what's happening. So Stephen said his dad was pretty happy that the farm had a lot of ground cover on it and was going well, which I thought was good feedback as well. So some plants starting to shoot, starting to fill in. I think it's really good. We've been talking about how I use Google Earth Pro for people to sort of start designing and thinking about, well, if I'm going to build strips, which way should I orientate them? Where's the water? Start doing that. So we've been doing that by just dropping a grid onto Google Earth Pro and then stretching it for the different widths and what's sensible. If we've only got small numbers, the strips have got to be pretty narrow. You actually want them to be grazing on a strip that shape rather than a strip that shape. They tend to be more competitive and clean up and utilise better and more stable that way. So we're trying to make the strips so that when they move into the next section of that strip, it's a shape like that with the electric fence there and the animals moving into it. So just that classic strip grazing look, but a few animals deep, not just one animal deep, because that doesn't seem to work as well either. Yeah, so if anyone wanted sort of me to drop a grid and sort of talk about that sort of how do you start thinking about that design, that water. I think I've got the right paddock, but I'm not sure. But I believe that Stephen's going to do a paddock of strips as the plan through this paddock, and I'd be following what's going on there just to sort of see how it works. So, yeah, it's a real low effort sort of way of getting your toe in the water. Sort of let Stephen build the strips and see how they go and what he has to do to train the animals and do all that sort of stuff, just to see how that works out over time and what's going on with the profit from the grazing. We talked a long time ago about putting in the auto drafter and getting sort of data in so that you can start to use it to select the more profitable ewes out of the flock. And so there's that combining with the sort of starting to put more grazing pressure on them that'll drive the animals to that different phenotype. So they'll tend to be sort of, what I've seen is that they tend to be sort of carry a bit more fat, be early maturing, moderate to low milk rather than chasing milk, all those sort of things. So yeah, low maintenance energy. There's quite a few people talking about that now. This is a graph of ground cover. So it's a relative ground cover. So from Farm Map 4D, and sort of we're just having a look at that and seeing what's happening. So if Stephen's property's in below 50%, that means he's got less ground cover than his neighbours. If it's over, he's got more ground cover than neighbours. And there's a sort of a nice trend sort of happening up here, which I really like. And that's what I'm trying to see. Well, when you start changing your management, can you get some sort of evidence of what's happening? So it's a relative ground cover. It's not an absolute ground cover. So as long as the neighbour's quite low, you can get quite high. But generally over time, you find that there's been a shift. And it's a good way of checking, are you on the right track or not? So are you starting to stabilise ground cover? I see it as the first thing that stabilises. So, when people start changing their management, with grazing and cropping, the first things that you pick up are better ground cover throughout the year and better soil structure. So the soil structure changes really quickly, which was a surprise to me. That you're actually starting to make a shift. So all the cover crop work that I've done with coal, all that sort of work, we did through central Queensland, and that was the thing that changed so dramatically, and everyone commented on that. If you start to increase ground cover, increase decomposing litter, starting to put plants back into that, more perennial plants back into it, the soil structure increases really rapidly. And even if they're not perennial plants, doing that multi-species covers and stuff really increases soil structure very quickly. This is sort of just trying to get an estimate of ground cover. So just uses the satellite data, the motor satellite data, and runs an algorithm over it. They started using this program out in Western Division, New South Wales, and then they've expanded it. It's sort of on its way. I really like it, but I only use it for this. I don't use it. There's a lot of other functions, but I only use it for ground cover. and looking at sort of what's changing over time. So just quickly, you were starting to pick up that this is a safe to fail trial. This was a loose and resown. This is different management of the lambing paddocks. It's quite, it's very creative, the ewe lambing paddocks. So they've got a water along a fence, and they're shifting the feed and that, and dividing it sort of up by moving the water and the feed. So getting recovery in the same paddock that way. So that'll be a good one to see how that goes in the future. And I just was interested. You can pick up the big desert. You can pick up all the center pivots and stuff from this satellite data. Just quickly, just those animal types. I find it hard to find sheep equivalents to this sort of diagram. We're looking at getting animal B, not animal A. So we want more stocky, early maturing. They tend to be more robust, have lower maintenance energy. I think that's pretty clear everywhere we go. So I think it's going to be the driver of. If we start getting, like if you could get virtual fencing, it'll be a very quick change, and then very, very, very quickly, the blockage would be getting animals that thrive under fully recovered grass that's going to increase landscape function. And then there would be a real big push for this type of thing. So not trying to breed animals for feedlot finishing, trying to breed animals that perform on fully recovered grass. So there's a lot of work going on in the States, in Brazil, South America, Mexico. They're really shifting. They're doing things with crossbreeding and selecting for early maturity. One that they select for, and I need to work out whether this is going to work in sheep and do some work on, is that they're selecting the cattle for weight per height, so kilograms per centimetre. So you want more weight for lower height. So because it gives you this is at 12 months, adjusted 12 months, so that you actually are getting those earlier maturing animals, that they're not sort of late growers, late maturers. So in the feedlot, they want to have a fair bit of frame to put that weight onto them. Whereas in this system, we're trying to get the very, very early maturing animals that are highly fertile. So the females are really highly fertile, really put on fat easily, and the size, the males have got lots of muscle and sort of always look after themselves, but not necessarily fat. So so it's that sort of thing that we're doing. I just wanted to just show a few photos. This was a project we did with Sydney University, so Stiper Native Grasses and Sydney University, was how could we rapidly increase landscape function? So this was the decision tree I wrote, or whatever you call it. For the other people, that sort of what I found was that there was when they go and monitor every 3 months, the sites, I'd say, what do you think it needs? And everyone would say it needs a graze. And I'm going, no, if we're going to increase landscape function, it's not that. So I was trying to do this sort of, if you just want to increase landscape function really quickly, get a lot of soil carbon, get a lot of organic matter, do all those things. So would grazing damage or remove perennial grass seedlings or young plants? If yes, do not graze. Are the perennial grasses actively growing? So if you want to increase landscape function, you want them to grow for as long as they can. If yes, do not graze, reevaluate when growth stops. Is there a large volume of fresh yellow litter in the base of the better perennial grasses that will turn into litter? If no, reevaluate. If yes, apply high animal impact and moderate defoliation. I had to go back and change the moderate defoliation because my moderate wasn't the same. I was trying to make sure that the sheep people didn't pick up the litter. So I said moderate defoliation, and they took that as meaning 50% of the green. And I had to go back, and this is an older one, and rechange it so to say don't let them pick up the litter, and then monitor again 6 months later. So just following that, this within 2 years we had these sort of soil changes. So that went from a grazed paddock back to sort of deep in litter. So this is a Mumblebone New Wellington, 12 mile there. Massive change in 2 years. Maloon down between Braidwood and Bungendore. Lots of organic matter. Didn't get that. At Wilmon Park, closer to Braidwood, we got the gateway. So this area that I was sort of using as the trial area was in the gateway, and it wasn't great. But this area started as pasture in front of it. That was the control. This was chocolate cake. This had deep, rich black soil created on it that you could cut it out. This was a treatment versus a set stock down at Southwest Victoria. So that was the neighbours down at Branksome. And this went back to dense perennials, still had some annuals and things in it, and this was versus the control. So that was about all I had. Is there any comments or questions? Any thoughts? Have I missed anything?
Well, we've got a couple of minutes. So if anyone's got any questions for Graeme, just type them into the Q&A. I'll do a bit of a wrap up, I suppose, while everyone's thinking about that, but really good. Thanks, Graeme, again. Another great webinar. I'm learning a lot as not a grazier, but as a cropper. So
I try and sneak a bit in about the cropping, Dan. So
yeah. No, it's really good that I'm getting a lot. One thing that's really coming out at me is that landscape function and using grazing to get that back. So I think that's, as regenerative farmers, that's what we need to be focused on. And as you said, production is important, but profitability and landscape function is more important. And I think that's, as you know, to be not sustainable, I don't like using that word because we don't want to sustain a bad practice, but to be regenerative, I think that's got to be front of our mind for any decision that we make. So can't see any questions. We're about at the top of the hour, so I'll wrap up here. Really big thank you again to Graeme. Fantastic information that's coming through in these webinars. I'm really enjoying them. Big thanks to the Wimmera CMA through the Australian Government's National Landcare program. So thanks very much for your support. Some housekeeping before we wrap up. The survey will come up in your window again, so I encourage everyone to fill them in for us. It gives us a lot of good feedback about the webinar and so we can design future webinars that we can make improvements on. So there is a change to the schedule for next week. Graeme is unavailable for next week's webinar, which we had scheduled. So we'll have a break next Thursday and we'll rejoin again the Thursday after, which that date is the 9th of June, Thursday 9th of June at 7 AM. That's correct, Graeme?
Yep, that's what I've got. Thank you.
Right. So instead of having that break on the 9th of June, we're going to have the break next week and then pick up again on the 9th. So that will all be up on our website. So if you've registered already for that webinar, it should automatically transfer over. Just be aware that we won't be here next Thursday. But if you haven't registered, yeah, that will be updated in 5 or 10 minutes. So the next webinar we've got is next Wednesday. So we'll be joined by David Hardwick, where we are talking all things bioferments and biostimulants in our Bugs and Brews webinar. So be sure to catch that. It's not Thursday, it's Wednesday at 7 a.m. So really looking forward to that discussion as well. So if you enjoyed today but missed a few things, it is being recorded, this webinar, and will be available on our YouTube channel. So there's been a few people that have looked for the link and gone back and watched it again. So there's obviously some good stuff in there that needs reviewing again. So so anyway, very good. Thank you very much, Graeme. Thanks to the
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks everyone for coming, and we will see you next Wednesday, hopefully at 7 a.m. with David. So
Great. Thanks for that.
awesome.
See you there.